Good morning. Thanks, Isaac. I know I'm not special. I tell myself that all the time. First and foremost, I know it's already been on repeat, but I want to wish everyone a happy Mother's Day, especially my lovely bride, wherever you're at in here. Taking care of our 4 wonderful children, and to my mom, if she's watching online as well. Make sure I cover all my bases this morning. I haven't texted her yet. It's 1909. Mabel Francis would be permitted to set sail for Japan at the age of 29. After a long acceptance process, for at that time, females, specifically single females, were not permitted to be or accepted to be missionaries. However, because of her background and her faithful ministry and training history, she was able to finally set sail at 29. God had taught her to entirely depend on Him for all her needs, and Mabel developed this lifelong habit of listening to His voice. She left for Japan with a kit of 3 dresses, 2 of which were culturally appropriate: a fork, a knife, a spoon, and a half pound of cocoa. When she arrived in Japan, Westerners were still were oddities among the people and viewed with suspicion. That didn't bother her because she planned to take as long as necessary to win their acceptance. She traveled by bike and preached when she could in and around Hiroshima until they got used to her. And out of that tolerance grew respect, and out of that respect grew love. Mabel's brother, Reverend Thomas Francis, would join her in 1913, and they would plant 20 churches, and then her widowed sister would follow in 1922. During the Depression, while in Japan, Mabel and her sister Anne faced a crisis as the denomination began to withdraw the missionaries because of lack of support. They were instructed to return back to the States to take a break and maybe even a reassignment to a new location. However, Mabel could not shake the conviction that God had called her to Japan. The 2 sisters would eventually then become independent missionaries that would continue to support churches and pastors in that area. Their decision was vindicated as God would continue to bless their ministry. This only set them up for yet another crisis again that happened in 1942. When they had the opportunity again, or were presented the opportunity to return to the States, then refusing, would endure the stigma of being branched as enemy aliens and suffering imprisonment. Anne was arrested, and Mabel's sister was arrested and put in internment camp immediately after Pearl Harbor. But Mabel would then be put on house arrest in the town that she lived in. Unable to communicate, unable to freely move for over a year, she prayed, "Lord, what do I do?" God answered her prayer by sending 3 sick people. She decided, if I can't preach in this place, I'll have a hospital. As she nursed for these 3 individuals for nearly a year before she was eventually taken away by the police and escorted out into prison as well. It would be 3 years until she'd be reunited with her sister. Mabel Francis and her sister would again face one more big crisis. Following World War II, the choice again from the denomination came to tell them to recoup after wartime ordeals. Yet what we're told is that the ladies were a little bit feisty, and they were little. They weren't strong in appearance. They walked straight out of the internment camps and back into the ministry of love among the Japanese people that they had adopted as their own. Mabel then began to visit Japanese soldiers in the hospitals, dividing amongst them chocolate bars and other things American GIs had given them, telling them, she was bold, "You lost the war," she told men, "but God has something for you yet." High-ranking officials then welcomed her back into her community, masked by deep emotion because of how much they cared for her. She and her sister received invitations to then speak, and they began to share with the discouraged and devastated people of Japan that the Bible talks about honoring your parents and the emperor. But they went way beyond that and said, it's got to go further than that. You need to believe in Jesus Christ. And hundreds did, and thousands more heard the gospel for the very first time. This life is simply an example of a lifestyle that is centered on the mark. A life that is centered on one supreme thing, Christ. The characteristics that drove them to look at lostness and Christ's mission above their own circumstances, above their own comforts, and even their own freedom. And I think these are some of the very same things in which Paul is writing to us today as we continue in our study on the book of Philippians. Last week, Terry launched our series in the book of Philippians, and the series we're calling The Center of the Mark. He shared with us the eventful start of the church in Philippi and the deep love that which Paul and the people of Philippi had for one another. He said this love was not just a love of simple friendship, but one of sacrifice. And he shared with us three things for us to value if we want the church to continue to stay focused on the mark. Now, this is a simple plug, but if you missed it, I want to encourage you to go back and check out our YouTube channel and watch that if you weren't here for that. It's great as we start this series. And so this morning as we continue, we're going to be in Philippians chapter 1, starting in verse 12. If you want to go ahead and flip there. We are going to see that Paul is going to be given a report, giving us where he's at. And I think we're going to see three characteristics of a lifestyle that is centered on the mark. Would you follow along with me as we read? It says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I have been put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. The first characteristic that I want us to see of a life that is marked, or is on the center of the mark, is a life of joy in unfavorable circumstances. Paul begins this section with the implications, or as he's in Philippi, trying to give a report, and he can sense the speculation, and he can perceive what is happening amongst the people in Philippi. They're concerned for him, as they might have known to some degree of what Roman prison would be like, and at the same time, what this would have on the implications for the mission that he was trying to accomplish. And it's an entirely normal reaction to lament our circumstances in the midst of suffering, like the Philippians might have been doing. Especially the kind that keeps us from the work that God has called us to do. While these reactions are normal to a degree, Paul's own reaction is to his suffering is to help us broaden our understanding of what God is doing in and through our unfavorable circumstances. Rather than telling them, this is what my condition is like, this is what I'm experiencing, this is what the food is like, this is what the guards are like, he starts off with a broad statement that God is at work. Probably not what they expected. And then he goes on to say, what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Now again, this could be a variety of topics in which Paul could be talking if he's painting broad or if he's painting narrow in his current situation. Two situations which he could conclude, or we could conclude, would be referring to the end of the book of Acts, and we see that it could include a riot, a 2-year imprisonment in Caesarea, an appeal to Caesar, a threat on his life, a shipwreck on the way to Rome, being house arrest, restricted in freedom, or his impending trial. Whether he's speaking of these events in the end of Acts, or he's speaking simply of his current circumstances, it is clear that there are less than favorable circumstances that Paul is enduring. Now he says we know according to Acts that he's in house arrest. For us, again, it's an uncommon thing maybe for us to understand. But the book of Acts helps us understand a little bit more of what would be happening. It might not be what we popularly think of, or what's been descriptions of a Roman prison. Acts 28 tells us that he still could have visitors. He was still able to preach the word. However, the only hindrance was that he would be shackled to a prisoner, or to a guard as a prisoner. And according to first century historians, he would have had 6 different soldiers every single day. Now, we don't know if these would have been the same soldiers or what that might be, but they would be in 4-hour increments. And again, there's some of this is speculation. Some of this is what we're gathering from other places, but I want us to understand that this is very likely what could have been going on for the life of Paul. This guard that would have been around him would have been an elite group of guards in the imperial guard. They would have been paid double of what a normal soldier would have been paid. Their main job and their main role was that they were protecting the emperor, key officials, and to keep peace in the city. They would have ranged from 15 to 32 years old and would not have been able to marry. And as you can imagine, because they couldn't have families and whatever, they would go back to the barracks. They would go back to these places. And Paul shifts this conversation to go, here's what's happening to me. Here's what I've been enduring. Giving no complaint, no personal current condition, he says this negative situation has actually turned out for good. How has it turned out for good? That the whole imperial guard and all of the rest hear the gospel. It's become known to all of the rest as well. Paul recognizes that God has sovereignly placed him in this place in Rome. In Acts 23, that we see that he has a call to eventually go to Rome. But now he's been faced in prison and put here in a way that he probably didn't picture coming to Rome. And yet Paul recognizes that everything he has experienced, God has sovereignly saw and placed it for a purpose. That he's been placed to reach a different people group. A people group that maybe haven't heard the gospel. At the same time, trying to then, I think you could put his money where his mouth is, where in the few verses prior in Acts, or in chapter 1, verse 6, and he says, and I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ Jesus. He was living that. He was living that same statement that he was then laying before them. He wanted them to see that their circumstances were not negative, but an opportunity for them to speak the gospel and to present the gospel. And it's important for us to see as well that as we endure our circumstances, that it's an opportunity, not an obstacle, for the gospel to be heard. Paul's audience would have been captive, right? They would have been captive. They would have been shackled to him and given orders to protect Paul. And you can imagine they probably were drawing straws or however, rolling the dice, figuring out, I don't want to be with this guy. He never shuts his mouth. You can picture this of these soldiers because word would have spread, right? We know who the people that have a really hard time shutting their mouth. I'm a youth pastor. Things get told to me all of the time. They would not only listen to Paul, but they would look amongst themselves and see that these soldiers would then spark other conversations in the barracks. These conversations would be flipped. And as we can see, as we look over at the end of chapter 4, at the very end of the book, we see that this has reached so far into the guard, that all of Caesar's household greets the other saints because the impact of the gospel being shared at the beginning of the letter. He goes on to say that it's even to all of the rest. Not only is it to the imperial guard, but all who are surrounding. And it goes beyond even what they can possibly imagine. And when we're in the middle of suffering, we never know what will happen. But we must trust that God is sovereign and that He can and often does advance the gospel through our personal hardships, such as imprisonment or cancer. Our job is to stay faithful, joyful, Christ-centered through suffering, confidently trusting He is wise, sovereign will. I saw this lived in my own life, actually within the last 6 months or so. A dear friend of mine has endured, the doctors haven't been able to pinpoint what exactly has been wrong with him. It's actually gone on for almost a year now. But last December, I received a phone call right before our Christmas party from another friend that this friend of mine was on the hospital bed and not sure if they were going to make it through the weekend. And being a pastor, we sometimes get called into these situations. And not knowing in my 7-hour drive on getting to Mayo Hospital and trying to figure out how to have this conversation, what am I going to see? What am I going to endure? I was met by a husband and wife who had this unwavering trust that even in the midst of these circumstances, God was in control. And God had placed them there for a purpose. And I heard story after story after story of doctors and nurses and even those patients and those waiting to see their family members hearing the gospel and seeing those who hear the gospel and those who are believers coming together and encouraging one another. People who have never met, sharing the gospel with one another as they endured suffering because their hope wasn't set on their circumstance, but in the one who holds all things together. Paul then shifts in this passage to chapter 14 from stuff that's outside of others hearing the gospel to those that are speaking the gospel. He uses the word brother for the second time in just 3 verses. He recognizes that the brothers in Rome actually, who loved Paul, had been impacted by observation of his lifestyle. Mind you, Paul had been in house arrest. People had been able to see him. He'd been able to have guests, to teach, to preach, to mentor, and so on. Paul's example of drawing others to Christ, making Christ attractive, and his joy that he had, we're told that actually built the confidence of those other believers around them. Those believers in Rome who observed Paul's sacrifice. That he had confident assurance in the face of impending death. That he had trust in a guy named Jesus and he was going to let everyone know. Not only did he never shy away from teaching and proclaiming the gospel, we also see that it's an opportunity for him to constantly display the glory of God. That God is at work and he's showing that this perceived situation in which the Philippians had for Paul is reassured in the fact that God is still moving. Even though Paul is in prison, the gospel is advancing. They can see a glimpse of God's unlimited power, revealing God's agenda prevails in whatever way he seems fit. He lives as if Christ was his greatest treasure. And I know that that's the next part as we continue on in the book, so I'm not going to go there. That even though there's this impending danger, Paul is able to look at, and we're going to flip ahead just a few verses, actually to my life verse, but this, to see how much, just to get a glimpse of how much Paul truly treasured the gospel. If we go to Philippians chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, he says, "But whatever gain I had, I count as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ." Paul's lifestyle was one that viewed Christ as supremely valuable. And in that, he was able to exude joy in the midst of these circumstances. The Roman believers gained confidence in the Lord because of the firsthand observation. Moments that brought Paul in crisis inspired those to deepen their own walk with Jesus. This resulted in them being filled with courage to be able to speak the gospel without fear. How much do we long ourselves to be able to speak the gospel without fear? Tony Merida, I always butcher that one, made this statement, and it's been one that's stuck with me, and I want us just to sit here with it. I'm sorry, it's not on the screen this morning. But he says, perhaps our failure to talk about the gospel to unbelievers is tied to the lack of talking about the gospel to anyone, including one another. Paul is consumed with the risen Christ, and he's always talking about Jesus to the Roman guard and his friends in Philippi. Yet another way we should imitate him. While you may be involved in many noble causes, noble and just causes, be a gospel person first. If you're fighting for slavery, for feeding the poor, caring for those with AIDS, do it with the good news of Jesus on your lips. Take all of your opportunities to serve and to love as occasions to speak wisely, winsomely, compassionately, and fearlessly. So my question this morning is, how do you view your obstacles? How do we view our unfavorable circumstances? And because it's Mother's Day, mothers, you face many unfavorable circumstances on a given day. Any dad can attest to that who's left with his kids for any amount of time. The strength required for a consistent, godly motherhood comes from the power of the Holy Spirit to produce faith, resolve, and perseverance. I'm told these days are short and they'll quickly pass. One day, you will long for the former small feet running up and down the stairs. The children will stop asking questions, and moments that God supplied joy will continue to fill your hearts with rejoicing. I want to encourage you as mothers to use this opportunity in these unfavorable moments. And I'm sorry that it comes to mind. The first unfavorable moment is a blowout diaper because of the season of life that I'm in. But also thinking of what my wife has endured. I wasn't going to say my name, but I did it anyway. As she's got a sick kid and she's trying to get all the other kids to the doctor, and her husband forgets to put the seats back in the van. And then she gets to the doctor's office only to find out she's a minute late for the doctor to be able to see her. That's an unfavorable circumstance, to say the least. But a lifestyle that's centered on the mark is a life of joy in unfavorable circumstances. This is what makes the gospel attractive. This is what makes life as a Christ follower different from those around us. And it's also a life that looks beyond ourself. The next characteristic that I want us to see, that it's a characteristic, a life that loves Christ's glory over our own. It says, some indeed preach from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. Paul appears to be making yet another shift in this conversation, identifying that there are two types of evangelists. There are two types of people in which they're speaking of the gospel. The first one I've called the negative example. The negative example is the one who preaches out of envy and rivalry. And one might ask, how can someone preach the gospel out of envy and rivalry? But we can simply say it as this, is that it comes down to the motives. What are the motives? The second time, moving along in this, he says, others do it out of good will. And he goes to expand upon them, right? And the first one, he does what? He says, they do it out of love, right? The same love that we've talked about before, this sacrificial love, this love for one another, that they preach the gospel because of the sacrifice that's been done on their behalf. Knowing that God has appointed them to proclaim the gospel for this purpose, the same way that Paul is appointed to proclaim the gospel here. This is what Paul was praying about in the last week's text also, that their love may abound more and more in the knowledge of who God is. They know that God doesn't waste opportunities or time. The second type, the negative example, the selfish ambition, it's probably not hard for us to determine or to put a definition to someone who's full of selfish ambition. But he also puts on the word there, not sincerely. Paul identifies that not everyone is on the same page when they preach the gospel. Some have described this as more of a competitive nature. And to the shame of many pastors, this example falls into this competitive nature. Who likes to be competitive? Anyone? Right? The very thing falls for those of us that proclaim the word on a daily basis as well. And Paul is speaking of those who do so, like what we see today, those that are trying to keep up with having their appearance and everybody look at them at the same time being one of influence, right? It's not wrong to be a good influence on someone. But if my striving to be an influence is greater than the message that I'm proclaiming, that's the problem. And that's what we have to look out for, as those who seek to bring attention to themselves and striving for their own name rather than Christ. For us to understand this, and we have to know that where we've been placed, God has appointed us as a defense of the gospel. This is not a random situation that Paul finds himself in, and it's neither a random situation that you find yourself in. But God has been orchestrating this from the beginning. And again, God has appointed you and I to be examples, to be the positive example. And we're going to go on to explain a little bit more of this in a second, in this last characteristic. And he says this: a life that celebrates when the gospel is shared is point number 3. Characteristics of a life that are centered on the mark is a life of joy in unfavorable circumstances, a life that loves God's glory over our own, and lastly, a life that celebrates when the gospel is shared. Notice that throughout this entire passage, as Paul has been speaking, there's been one central thing, right? There's been the center of the mark that's come through very clearly on Paul's message. That's the gospel. And yet how Paul handles this is very different and distinct from how he's handled other situations. As we know, when Paul writes most of his other letters, we see that he's writing to correct something. He's writing to adjust doctrine. He's trying to help them correct and align with what the truth is. But this doesn't seem to be the same message or attitude that we see in the later part of this text. It's very opposite of what we find in Galatians when he says, "I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one preached to you, let him be accursed." Paul is speaking here to Galatians that there's people that are trying to add to this gospel message. It's very different from what we read here in Philippians. It's as if I've called it that there's a tolerance or a sliver of grace that Paul seems to exude, because there's a common denominator in both of them, right? Christ. Both preach Christ. So the content of the message is greater than the messenger itself. The weakness of human vessels. Paul's attitude is drastically different. And it's important for us to see here that it's the content of the message that makes this so important. That although the motives are different, and although maybe the intentions are different, we can look at the examples of those who seek their own interest, who try to put their names on everything so that they're the ones that are the influencers. What matters, as Paul is communicating to us, is that Christ is at the very center. And so Paul's offer of charity seems to be one that is one that we should probably try to exude. Now, I'm not saying that we should allow sin, and I'm not saying that we should not be quick to cover our doctrine and make sure that we are sound. But as a Christian community, we are quick to vilify, we are quick to cancel people, pastors, teachers, who do things that possibly make us cringe, yet preach the same gospel. There are many that don't, mind you, right? This is also what Paul is talking about in the first part of the letter, that he's talking about discernment, right? All knowledge and discernment, that their love may abound. We should be a people that pray and strive to portray a clear gospel message. A Christ-honoring, people-loving motives, pure motives for the simple advancement of the gospel. As we conclude, Paul says something to put this all together. He lays it out for us in verse 14. He says, "What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense, right, false motives, or genuine, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice." His joyful attitude before the Roman guards proved to be a huge impact for them. His consistent testimony of his joy in unfavorable circumstances, coupled with the power of the gospel, made eternal impacts. Because God is sovereign and is advancing his gospel, we should view our circumstances and opportunities as ways to share the gospel. Do you somehow think that where you live is only a stepping stone to what's next? And therefore you have no need to speak to your neighbors and really be on mission? Think again. Where you live is no accident. See your circumstances as God-ordained opportunities. There's reason to believe that this strategy exuded by Paul, modeled by Paul, won't work today. There's no reason this won't work today. As our model and strategy of evangelism, living in an attractive way, not falsely, right? Living in an attractive way and joyfully in the midst, a joyful lifestyle in the midst of unfavorable circumstances, that the world around us might see that we proclaim the greatest news ever told, that true life is found only in the Son, Jesus Christ. And as we treasure him and this sound message, we produce boldness, inspire one another to continue on the mission in which we are called to the day he takes us home. So a question to leave you with this morning is this: does my lifestyle bring attention to the center of the mark, or does it bring more attention to myself? May it be the former. Would you pray with me? Father, we come before you this morning. Lord, thanking you for Paul's example, and God, how you've used him in so many ways, used him throughout so many ways in history to advance your gospel. Not only to those in the unknown, but Father, also to other believers, to continue to spur us on to a deeper, supremely valuing of you. And so, Father, would you help us to evaluate? Would we be people that are more concerned with your glory, your attention, than a people that are focused on ourselves? And may that have rippling effects on this community and the world around us. In Jesus' name, amen.